Hey, I'm Alex Radical from Board Game Co, and today we're going to be talking about why my city is in my top 100 games of all time, but Gloomhaven isn't. And Gloomhaven isn't in my collection anymore, which is why I have Frosthaven here as a stand-in, although honestly I do consider the games fairly equal as far as how I'd rank or rate them. I think Gloomhaven is a little simpler and easier to get into, but I think Frosthaven does a little bit more with it, and let's be honest, neither one is particularly simple or easy to get into. I kind of have them but equal, but that's a conversation for a different day. But let's go back to the conversation. Why my city is in my top 100 games of all time, and why Gloomhaven is not. Now, you might need some background for this video, you might not, depending on if you know what's going on, but let's give you some general background. But before we start with the background, ultimately this video is kind of a response to a bunch of people who had a problem with the fact that Gloomhaven was not in my top 100 games of all time, and or that I should reframe what my top 100 games of all time is so it's more clear to the viewer what the point or purpose of that list is. One of those two things. And I will say, anyone and everyone who commented was incredibly respectful. I have no issues whatsoever when people disagree with how I do things. I do have an issue when people treat people on the internet like they're not people and forget that there's humans on the other side of the camera, but ultimately, everyone here was awesome and amazing, and so thank you all for being an incredibly great crowd of people, regardless of whether you agree with things I do or don't do. I'll also say that, in general, I try not to respond or engage with, larger conversations or full videos on the channel around something that an individual didn't like. But sometimes I miss a note, sometimes I miss a beat, sometimes a bunch of people disagree or dislike something, and then I do find the reasons to go ahead and do a full video, partially because I like talking about things, but I also think it just makes for a good conversation. This is something that enough people did have a concern or questions or disagreement with how I was doing things. I'd probably say in the range of 30 to 50 people commented, and if 30 to 50 people commented, then the actual number of people who thought that is probably a higher number. Now, it's still, you're talking about a few hundred from thousands, but that's still enough of a group of people that I wanted to have this conversation, explain my line of thinking, talk about why, where, the goal of the list, all that stuff, at least from my perspective. And if I change minds, great, and if I don't, that's totally fine. I still think it's an interesting conversation to have. Now that some of you are totally confused as to what actually happened, let's give you some information as to what actually happened. I'm currently in the middle of filming my top 100 games of all time. This is a video series I do every single year. Every single year I do my top 100 games of all time with the name of that year. 2022 edition, 2023 edition. That's relevant, we'll come back to that. This year, in 2023, doing this edition or whatnot, and by the way, this particular video right now, I don't know if it goes up while I'm still in the middle of the series, or I don't know if it goes up when the series is over. So as I reference some things that are coming up towards the top 10, I'll be a little vague and get into it that way. But either way, as I'm filming my top 100 games of all time as of 2023, in the third or so video I talked about how Tenaris Adventures is a game that has dropped from me as I've spent hundreds of hours in the system. It's still on my top 100, but it is a game that has gone down from like my top 30 to my top 80 or so, just based on spending 150 hours plus in the system and growing a little bit more, not exhausted, not disliking it, but have that interest, that desire, that excitement about it has gone down a bit as I've played more. And then I talked about the fact that Gloomhaven, which is a system that between Frosthaven, between Gloomhaven, between Jaws of the Lion, I have probably spent 300 hours-ish in that system, and that's a game that I still like it. I still think it's a good game. I would still recommend it with caveats, but ultimately it's a game that has left my top 100. And this is where we are in the video. Because there is a large enough group of people that were like, hey, this doesn't really feel like it's a top 100 games of all time video. It feels like it's a top games you want to play right now, or a games that you're currently in the mood for, disregarding how good a game actually is or how much enjoyment it has given you over the long term. Shouldn't Gloomhaven and the 300 hours it's given you be reflected in the nature of a top 100 games of all time video? Those are reasonable questions. The answer is it won't be, but that's going to be the point of this discussion. My line of thinking, what my goal is, why I do this list videos in general, what my point or goal of this series is, but that's kind of catching you all up to the general construct of what's happening and why we're here right now. To that end, let's talk about my goal for these lists. But first and foremost, and the most important thing to cover, is at the beginning of my series, the beginning of my top 100 games of all time, I am very clear about the criteria for the list, how I rank things, how I scale things, what's included, what's not included. Games that aren't in my collection are not in the list video. They're not in this series of top 100 games of all time. And I did have someone, a patron, a Discord member, had reached basically comment saying, well, then why not just name it? For the sake of transparency, why not just name it the top 100 games in your collection? And the answer is because my collection, the 300 or so games in my collection, do reflect the 2,000 plus games I've played in my 12 years in the hobby. There's a reason they're in my collection. It doesn't count the games I've never played, but we'll get to that later in the video. But I've played a lot of games. I think it does reflect the top 100 games of all time, from the subset of games I've played, but I think that's assumed. And yes, they are in my collection, and there's very few gaps, but again, we'll get to that later. But anyways, the disclaimers are very present in the very beginning of the series. So if you watch the series at all, and at the beginning of every single video, I'm like, hey, if you want to see how this list is formed, check out those 2 minutes. So the biggest thing is, before we get into any of my explanations, if the video series doesn't work for you, if you don't find that you're not getting the information that you are looking for from this top 100 list, that's fair, but I am pretty direct and transparent about how I put things together. So if it doesn't work for you, but at least you have that information. Now, as far as what my goal is with this list, I'll start by saying that I love list videos. I think list videos are the best possible board game content you can watch. On my channel, on others, ideally on an aggregate. Ideally have a few channels that you watch and watch a bunch of their top games of all time, top games of 2023, top 10 area control games. Watch a bunch of those videos, and the reason you should is because there's so many board games coming out every single year. There's so much media coming out every single year. You can't possibly keep up with the number of games that are showing up, and you can't possibly and shouldn't. You shouldn't be buying games just because every single day there's someone who loves a new board game. Because sure, my channel, today I might have just recently reviewed Sankoria and gave it a 5 out of 5. I think it's a fantastic game from Osprey Games. But, you know, someone else in their channel just reviewed that game, gave that a 5 out of 5. Someone else reviewed this, loved that. These people are raving about that. That person's posting on social media about that. These 3 people just got this game and are talking about it in your Board Game Geek group. There's everyone every single day is enamored with something new. Do you know what's more useful, more helpful to trying to establish what games might be a good recommendation for you? Not the cult of the new, not the thing that someone else is excited about today, but seeing a bunch of games show up on a bunch of people's lists. That's usually a good indicator. Because as a content creator, or just someone who's buying board games, frankly, you're always getting the new things. You're always excited about the new things. But I think it's a far stronger testament to how something is, or how something does, when you see it on a list, and it's not even a game from this year. It's a game from 3 years ago, and there's a bunch of people who are still talking about that when they talk about their top 10 area control games, or their best games of all time. And that's not something that's top of mind, that's something that has stood the test of time and lasted. I think that the top 10 games of whatever, generally, and especially if you have an aggregate of information, I think that's the best way to drive your board game purchases. Getting information on not what's hot, what's new, what's exciting, what just showed up on your table, but the things that are still present on multiple people's lists years down the road. Granted, the top 10 games of 2023 is still going to be somewhat new, but at least you can have an aggregate. You can see that a game like Apiary has been on so many people's lists, and you can see that whether it is or isn't for you, we just don't know, but at least you can see that a lot of people had that as one of their best games of the year, and that's something worth noting as opposed to the fact that someone somewhere one time loved a game. And again, that includes my taste. Throughout this video, I'm going to be talking about one particular game that isn't well loved, but that's a relevant data point. I love it. I love it years later. I love it while having finished a campaign and diving back into it, but not everyone does, and those are all relevant data points. But I love list videos because of that. And to that end, my goal with the top 100 games of all time is specifically a list of my favorite games as it changes over time. Because that is part of the conversation. The list will change over time. The list should change over, well, I don't know if it should change over time, but it does change over time. The list effectively is every single year me ranking how I feel about all the board games I've ever played, but that they're in my collection. And again, the distinguishing factor that they're in my collection does have 1 or 2 gaps, which we'll get into later. For the most part, the nature of it being in my collection, there's a reason they're in my collection. They're in my collection because I love them. This is not a top 100 games in my collection. This is top 100 games, and the ones in my collection are going to be there because I selected them from everything else. But it is a list that's meant to reflect my favorite games that have stood the test of time, that are new, that are here, and the list will iterate. Every year, games will be added to the list. Every year, games will be taken off. But it's interesting to see which games stick around. It's interesting to see how things move around within the list. It's interesting to understand where things adjust based on time. One of the biggest and most hardest parts about being a board game reviewer is the fact that information is always sought today. Everyone wants to know your opinion of the new game today. but I only just got it, and I ideally want to play it multiple times, ideally with multiple groups, multiple player accounts, ideally I want to let it settle. I want to have months under my belt, but the problem is you don't have that luxury. You have to play it multiple times right away because nobody wants a review that you played a game once. You ideally should be spreading it out multiple over a natural time period as opposed to forcing it. There are times that my opinion of a game changes, and I'm certain it changes, because I force myself to engage with it multiple times in a short time frame as opposed to naturally engaging with it over time. And that affects how you feel about things. The nature of being a board game reviewer, the nature of, and not just board game, any reviewer, is people always want information on the newest things right away. The top 100, to me, is an opportunity to kind of talk about the things that are really lasting. The things that made their way onto my list. And maybe I reviewed it earlier this year and it's still at the top of my mind and it's exciting. Maybe it's something I've been playing for 7 years and I want you to know about it. But it's a good opportunity to tell you about how I feel about any number of different games based on everything. Based on playing them, based on not playing them, based on a desire to play them, based on all the things. Where do these games rank? That's kind of my point of the list. And that's where Gloomhaven comes into the picture. Not My City. My City's here for a different reason. We'll talk about that in a second. But Gloomhaven was my number 3 game of all time in 2022. 300 hours later, it's not on the list. It's still a good game. I believe I will still be playing more Frosthaven. And I don't think I'm going to regret that. It's just not the thing I most want to play. It's not the thing that has me as excited about it as I am about other game systems, or not game systems, other games. And that's because Gloomhaven, by the very nature of how it operates, it burned me out on that system. And that is a reflection of how I'll rate it. I loved Gloomhaven so much, 70 hours in, 80 hours in, wherever I was when I reviewed it when I put it on my list in 2022, I liked it so much that it was my number 3 game of all time. This is so good. And then, hundreds of hours later, I'm like, I don't know if I want to play this. And that is a reflection of how, I don't want to play it, I shouldn't say that. I'm just less excited. I'm far, far less excited. If I happen to never play Gloomhaven again, I don't know if I necessarily care. But I assume I still will, and I also don't mind that. But that is a reflection of how it will rank on my lists year to year. That is a reflection of how I feel about it. That is the nature of opinions changing over time, and it's a relevant data point. There's multiple relevant data points. It's relevant that Gloomhaven, as a system, gave me hundreds of hours of enjoyment. It's also relevant that it's no longer giving me that same level of enjoyment hundreds of hours in. And I'll say that it's both a compliment on Gloomhaven, but it's also a dig to an extent. The reason My City is here in this video is My City is a game I've played 200 plus times, and it's still in my top 100 games of all time. Wild Descent is a campaign game that gave me 10 missions to complete, as opposed to dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens. I don't know the count in Gloomhaven, but 50 plus missions, whatever it is. And the fact that Wild Descent gave me 10 missions to complete meant it gave me a campaign that I enjoyed and still want to keep playing. I still want to dive back in despite having played it those 10 missions. I've played more than that by now, but it's like I've gone through it multiple times, but it's a game that I'm still interested in playing it because it whetted my appetite and didn't ever fully fulfill it because of the nature of how it built the system out. Cthulhu Death May Die is, I think, my second or third most played game of all time as far as hours spent in the system. I think it's Gloomhaven as an aggregate category, then Zombicide as an aggregate category, and then Cthulhu Death May Die as a singular title. I think that's the order of hours spent in any number of games. And Zombicide as a system, the Cthulhu Death May Die as a system, Zombicide is in my top 100, has been in my top 100 since discovering it. Cthulhu Death May Die has been in my top 10 games of all time year after year since playing that, despite continuing to spend time in that system. And so I think it is interesting that spending hundreds of hours in a system does not inherently make it that it leaves the top 100. But it's interesting to note those that stay and those that go. Some games can stand up to that amount of time in it, others not so. And obviously this is still within the bounds of my own taste. To some people, there'll be hundreds of hours in Gloomhaven and loving it and wanting more out of it, and that's great. For me, it is a game that has moved out of my top 100 based on the way I engaged with it, and I think ultimately that's going to be how I do my top 100. I am going to rank my top 100 because it is a changing list that adjusts over time. And it's not just a changing list. It's not just like, I saw there were some comments about, this is just a list of the games you want to play right now. To a certain extent, that is how I guess the question would be, how do you rank a top 100 list objectively if you don't allow for things changing? Because I either have to refuse to allow Gloomhaven to change, because I have to hold it to where it was as opposed to where it is, or I have to constantly approach the list newly every single year with where my current opinion of those games are. And to be very clear, there are games in my top 100 that haven't been played in a year plus and may not be played for a year plus, but they're still on my top 100. And there are games that I have played 86 times this year and are still in my top 100. My top 100 does just overall reflect my opinion of those games based on how highly I hold them at the time that I put that list together, knowing full well that some of them might not get played this year and others will be played the next day. That's the very nature of this top 100 list. Now, there are legitimate gaps here. There are legitimate things that are questions of, well, that's missing information from a top 100 list. And I think that's true, but there will always be legitimate gaps. There's a bunch of legitimate gaps. Another game system that is not in my top 100, but arguably should be, and when I say arguably should be, I mean more than Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven I have no qualms about. These next two, I have actual qualms over because I think they're interesting conversational pieces. I think Pandemic Legacy as a system is a system that I love, and it's a system that I've played a lot, and it's a system I can see myself playing again and being excited to play again. And I don't put it in my top 100 because it's not in my collection, and that's a data point that I have in play. I might rethink putting Pandemic Legacy in the collection. I might. That's an interesting, in my top 100, I should say. Because I do think Pandemic Legacy is so good, and honestly, even though I've played Season 1 twice, Season 2 twice, and Season 0 once, I'm still down to play any one of those tomorrow. I think the main data point I'm walking away from this conversation is that I'm rethinking whether I should put Pandemic Legacy back on my top 100. Not this year, but perhaps next. I might approach that. Another game that's interesting, that the only other game I could think of that I would debate whether it should or shouldn't be my top 100, again, Gloomhaven I don't debate. Based on the way I approach this, I have no qualms about Gloomhaven. Not to diss on Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven's fantastic. I still recommend it with caveats. But another game that I'd consider is Tigris and Euphrates. Tigris and Euphrates is one of the better games I've ever played that I happened to get rid of because within my game group, I always won. I was just better at the game than the people on my game group, which is a problem I've had with 2 or 3 games over time. The other 2 or 3 just wouldn't go in my top 100. Specifically, it's A Few Acres of Snow, Galaxy Trucker, and Tigris and Euphrates are the only 3 games I've ever gotten rid of because I just always won at those games. The nature of playing 2,000 plus games is sometimes you'll find games that you're just always going to win at, and that's just not fun for the other people. So from those 3, Galaxy Trucker and A Few Acres of Snow I think are very good, but they would not be top 100 material regardless, versus Tigris and Euphrates might. Again, I might reconsider putting Tigris and Euphrates in my top 100 in future years because I think that's interesting. I think that's relevant. But meaning effectively, I guess the way I'd look at it is Pandemic Legacy is I'd happily play, and I think I will again. And Tigris and Euphrates is a specific, unique limitation that doesn't make me think less of the game. I do think that Gloomhaven doesn't hold up to hundreds of hours of play for me, whereas I think Tigris and Euphrates is more of an anomaly, if that makes sense. But again, legitimate gaps in my top 100. There are legitimate gaps. Another legitimate gap, and an interesting one to get into, is the fact that I've played Gloomhaven for 300 hours. Meaning, effectively, this year was never an issue. This year, I always planned on talking about the fact that, hey, my number 3 game of all time is gone, but I've played it hundreds of hours. So this year, that information was always going to be present, and then you could do what you want with that information. But I may not bring that up every single year, which means in future years, the knowledge that a game gave me 300 hours of enjoyment, but now I'm done with it, is a legitimate gap from the top 100. And I think that's just a legitimate gap, unless I bring it up every year. It's an interesting piece of information, because I do think that the fact that a game gave you 300 hours of enjoyment is something worth recommending. That's something notable. That is something that most games won't do for you. So the enjoyment I've gotten out of Gloomhaven, very, very legitimate concern as to where that information gets lost in this recommendation of games for all time. The nature of this particular list is still not going to have it every year, because this particular list is how I feel about games given all the factors I've been exposed to in that year, in that point of time when I put that list together. Other legitimate gaps, because there are still legitimate gaps, is the games I didn't play. This past year, I haven't played Nucleum. I still haven't played Tiwanaku or Tiwantisu. I haven't played so many different games. War of the Ring I haven't played. I haven't played Twilight Imperium. There are so many games out there that I haven't played. Those are also legitimate gaps to any top 100 list. The knowledge that there are great games out there that I haven't been exposed to, again, they're just gaps in the list. There are always going to be gaps in any sort of information. There's also the gap of what about games I got rid of because I couldn't table because of group limitations, size issues, or whatever it is. Feed the Kraken is a great game, that eventually I was like, you know what, my group's just not large enough to experience and appreciate and enjoy that game, and so it's gone. And that's a legitimate concern. Captain Sonar is a fantastic game. If you have a group that can handle 8 people, I think I'd put that in my top 100 if that was regularly being played, versus I've played Captain Sonar one time. Again, it kind of goes in that same kind of category of it is a legitimate gap, but similar to the games I didn't play, it's just the nature of any top 100 is always, any list of any sort is always going to reflect the limitations on the person playing them. Recommendations, the recommendation, yeah, they're just, I guess, legitimate gaps in the list. But there's also useful knowledge in the top 100 list as far as the way I put it together. There's a lot of useful knowledge. I think the drop-off of Gloomhaven is useful information. The fact that it was my number 3 game of all time and then left is useful. It's useful to know that that game is so good that at one point I loved it. It's also useful to know that that game incentivizes you to play it for a large amount of time, and it burnt me out on the system. Even though I both loved it, it also burnt me out. Those are both relevant and useful pieces of information. A game that I love that doesn't hit the table, perhaps I shouldn't recommend as much either. The nature, again, if I talk about, because I talk about how my list does have recency bias, if I've played a game, it's more likely to get bumped back up. And I think that's a good thing. I think if I think a game is one of the best games ever, Mage Knight, which is fantastic, by the way. It's a fantastic game. I do recommend it, but it finally dropped out of my top 100 because it's such a hard game to table. And it's not that I sat there and analyzed, well, it's a hard game to table, so it shouldn't be there. It's just that even though every time I play Mage Knight, which I happen to play it today, by the way, even though every time I play Mage Knight, I'm reminded of how good of a game it is, it's also so hard to table and such a chore to table, and it just doesn't get tabled, that should I be recommending a game strongly in my top 100 year after year after year if it's been 6 years since I played it? And the way my top 100 naturally works is that over time, the longer I go that I don't play a game, it doesn't get that little bump whenever I play it again. Every time I play a game, it gets a little bump, a little bump, a little bump. Games that I haven't played in a year, they do drop down a few points in my top 100, and eventually they do tend to move off the list. While it's frequently happened on my list that a game that I haven't played in a year plus is still on my top 100, usually they go down over time, and it's infrequent that a game I haven't played in 2 years is still on my top 100. It's infrequent. I think that long of a gap should affect how strongly I'm recommending that game. Again, I think that's useful knowledge, useful information. Which games stick around and which games don't is also useful information from the top 100 games of all time every single year list. The practical reality is that from 2020 to 2021, I believe 31 games dropped off, which means 31 games came on. The same number exactly in 2022 happened as well. From 2022 to 2023, it's a little less. I think there's around 27 new games to the list, something like that. I have to double check the exact numbers, but it's a smaller difference. But that means around a third of the list is changing every single year, which does put it in flux, and the flux should be there. Both from the games that are new, that I play, that I discover, that I find, but also from finding out which games stand the test of time the most, which ones hold steady, which ones hold strong. Between 2020, 2021, and 2022, across those 3 years, there are 51 games that have stood strong on my top 100 3 years in a row. And that's relevant. Within a changing list that's constantly subject to the fluctuations of, well, everything, 51 games have stood strong. 51 games have been consistent. From 2021 to 2023, I don't know the full number of how many have stood strong for 4 years straight. But since doing that top 100 for 3 years straight, that many games have stood there consistently, which again I think is relevant and useful information. The nature of the list is meant to be a changing over time. It is the top 100 games of all time based on the year I'm currently putting the list together, based on how I feel across a variety of circumstances. And so I guess to wrap up this video, this conversation, this interesting, separate meta discussion of what goes into a top 100 list, Gloomhaven is not in my top 100 games of all time. I still think highly of it. I got rid of Gloomhaven because I play it primarily on PC anyway, so I don't really need it. Versus Frosthaven, still going through that one, and I'm fine finishing it. I'm not in a rush to finish it, but I'm fine finishing it. There are other games that I've played for hundreds of hours in my top 100. That's a big thing to realize, is not all games burn out because you played them. And that's relevant. I've played Castles of Burgundy 86 times this year alone. I played Mythic Mischief 53 times this year. Lost Ruins of Arnak 40 times. A Feast for Odin 31 times. Those are all games that rank incredibly highly in my top 100 this year, despite playing through them an absolute ton. The reflection of where Gloomhaven isn't that I played a game a lot, and therefore it's gone. Ultimately, some games stand up to hundreds of hours of gameplay, and others don't as much. I think for me, campaign games in general almost incentivize you to push through things. The nature of the system, they incentivize you to push through things to an extent that sometimes just isn't going to result in as rewarding of an experience. It results in a flash in the pan experience. And a flash in the pan experience will result in a flash in the pan rating on my top 100 games every single year. I think the best types of campaign games, the ones that have held strong, at least for me, and again, this is my list of my opinions, are going to be the ones that either don't push you to play that much. Castle of Burgundy, I can play it whenever I want, and I play it whenever I want. Gloomhaven, I feel the need to finish something, and that changes how I interact with it. Wild Descent, Pandemic Legacy, I felt the need to finish something, but they were smaller and more manageable experiences, and that changed how I interacted with it. For me, games that want you to spend hundreds of hours in them, in order to experience and finish them, I think those probably will see high rises, but then also high falls in my top 100. And that's where we are, I guess. In any case, that's kind of the conversation piece. Again, I don't know when this video goes up. I don't know if you finished the top 100 or not, or where we are with things. Ultimately, at the end of the day, again, the first thing is thank you to everyone who commented and engaged, because everyone did so respectfully, which is great. I don't mind disagreement at all. It's just the way people disagree, which is always the question. And everyone was like, hey, this doesn't do it for me in the same way. So thank you to all of you. And also, if the top 100 is a list series that you enjoy and continue watching and all that, and great. Awesome. I'm happy to have you on board. If you find that based on the way I'm putting it together, it doesn't serve your needs, I respect that. I do. I think for me, I'm still going to continue doing it that way because, and again, keep in mind, there is a degree of spark change here. The things that make me reconsider are the Pandemic Legacy and Tigers and Euphrates. And that I hear more on. For me, Gloomhaven did have a large rise and did have a large fall, and that's just the way I feel about it. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.